But today, for the penultimate one, we have Dr. Lesley Uttley talking about the problems with systematic reviews, a living initiative for research integrity. Lesley's worked at SCHARR since 2011 as a systematic reviewer. Her background is in psychology, so she has a BSc and a PhD in psychology from the University of Sheffield. So she's been in Sheffield one way or another for a long, long time, and at SCHARR for over a decade. She's worked on systematic reviews as part of SCHARR TAG, the SCHARR Technology Assessment Group, but her key interests are around the impact of the research team and people on the outcomes and outputs of systematic reviews, and obviously that's what she's going to be looking at today. So just give me a second, Lesley, while I switch around the slides, and then, yay, I'll hand over to you, Lesley, okay?
Thank you, Claire, for the introduction and for inviting me today. I'll just put my video on briefly so you can see me and that I'm not a bot, but I'm going to switch it off so that I feel totally uninhibited. Okay, so I thought we would flip things around a little bit by talking first about what research culture is and how that relates to my MRC fellowship, which is systematicrevolution.com, which I'll explain, and then go back to research culture to understand and contextualize the findings that I'm seeing and talk about research integrity initiatives. So I am funded by a UK MRC Career Development Award, and I'm using a combination of the findings from that and also observations that others have made in the research culture space, and also my personal observations. I think one of the biggest privileges about a fellowship is that it does give you that time and space to actually absorb some of the debates from research culture. And I know that when I'm not on a fellowship, it's a struggle to just keep up with the things that I need to do and that I'm funded to do. So I'd just like to acknowledge that privilege. So the Royal Society defines research culture as encompassing the behaviours, values, expectations, attitudes and norms of our research communities, and that it influences researchers' career paths and determines the way that research is conducted and communicated. Just to get a snapshot of how research culture feels, on the left is a word cloud generated by asking thousands of academics to say the first 3 words that come to mind to describe current research culture. And the prominent words are often quite negative. Not all of them. There's also collaborative and supportive. But we have the words challenging, pressured, stressful, elitist. And then when you ask people to describe what the ideal research culture would be, you have a lot more positive terminology: creative, diverse, secure, funded. And so that just kind of gives a snapshot of how it maybe feels to be an academic and exist in this culture. But I just wanted to break it down a little bit further and remove that context by reminding ourselves of what it is that we're in science for. We generally operate in this cycle, which is called the PPDAC problem-solving cycle, where we start with a research question, we design the study, we conduct the study, we publish it, and we think about how that informs the next study and the next hypothesis. So what do we mean by research culture? Well, we mean problems of the academic reward system and some of the incentives. Now, I like this meme, but Luke Miller told me this morning that this baby looks angry, but it's not supposed to. This baby is supposed to be celebrating a mark. And so I obviously need to break that down because I've used a meme that is not as accessible as it should be. But just to contextualize things a little bit more, why should this meme resonate with academics? Why should we celebrate finding something significant? Going back to that cycle of research, well, it's the fact that in academia, publications are the currency. They're the currency to maintain a secure job contract, to get promoted, and they're generally valued in metrics. And we sell our publications to a profit-making journal system, which are often more interested in finding or publishing novel or new research than in the quality or integrity. So we are pressured to find something new. It's called positivist research. The journals rely on academics who are not funded to perform the peer reviews and have very little time to do so, and they have their own research and careers to worry about, so they are not able to dedicate sufficient time to peer review. So it's a flawed system. They're on precarious research contracts themselves, and they don't get appropriate recognition and assessment, usually beyond journal publications or being named on bids. Early career researchers are often not named on bids, and they therefore disappear to other industries or other parts of the academic infrastructure. And it leaves behind a fairly homogeneous demographic of researchers who know how to play the game and can use it to their own advantage. And it is them who will determine which studies and which research is conducted next. And that, in a nutshell, is the publish or perish research culture that we tend to operate in academia. And it's not particularly healthy. It's not how you would design it from the beginning, if you could, but it is the system that we operate in. And it fuels things like paper mills and predatory journals, which are cropping up ever more. So I'm not the first to make these observations, and the field of psychology in particular has been really leading these conversations about questionable research practices and how there are behaviours that we can do, that we can influence the research which have negative impacts. Things like p-hacking, where we look for significant results, where we perform multiple analyses until we find something significant. Doing statistical analyses without the right expertise, and not saying what we're going to do before we start to do it by pre-registering or pre-specifying. In general, there is a lack of reproducibility, and studies especially that have marginally reached significance often fail to be replicated, which really shows the effects of the perverse academic incentives on the evidence ecosystem, and in the fact that a lot of that have gone on to inform further research cannot be repeated. Harking is a phenomena hypothesizing after the results are known, and it refers to this tendency that we all have to write up a paper as though we always predicted the result that we found, that the hypothesis was always suspected by us in the beginning. And it gives this kind of ridiculous phenomenon that makes all scientists look like they are psychic and predict the future, but it does also have this sinister quality to it, in that it gives researchers the opportunity to justify and provide the narrative around that significant result and put that in the background section in order to sort of justify why they've found this finding and how it's going to influence the study that they do next. Another questionable research practice, researcher degrees of freedom. And it basically refers to the fact that given any data set, you can apply arbitrary rules, thresholds, statistical models, approaches, different cutoffs in order to find something significant. And there are papers that have shown that this is possible, and with quite ludicrous results, but really demonstrates how important it is to say how you're going to perform an analysis by way of a statistical analysis plan, and to pre-specify and to pre-register it in order to stop those researcher degrees of freedom from creeping in. Spin is the tendency for researchers to, in the effort to find or highlight something novel or interesting from their research, to point to something that is maybe not an accurate reflection of the final report, but it makes the paper sound more interesting. And it can involve things like pointing to numerically superior results, or using causal language where it's not quite appropriate. It tends to happen a lot in the abstracts of papers, where the final goal message of the paper is not entirely consistent with the final report. Conflicts of interest doesn't receive enough attention additionally, because it usually boils down to reflecting on financial payments received from companies or sponsors or organisations, and whether that's expenses or honoraria or gifts, stocks and shares. But actually, although those are often not declared appropriately, we don't often take time to think about those non-financial conflicts and researcher allegiances that often influence how we feel about the research question that we have. It might be that we have included studies on that particular intervention. We may have designed the intervention, or we may just have optimism. And it generally affects research when you are invested in the research question and what you're going to do next. And then personal conflicts of interest is, you know, knowing people who work in that intervention, and it's not a bad thing to have conflicts of interest. It's just important that we take the time to reflect on what they are. And if we do really hope that research goes in a certain direction, then we probably aren't the best people to be the PI of that project. It's probably best handled by somebody who is disinterested. This slide is a screenshot from a presentation at the International Research Culture Conference, which was at Warwick last year. And it talked about how we have a kind of monoculture in academia, which is because we reward the lone researcher, the single genius that is behind any research study or project. And the support roles are the people doing the legwork very often aren't given sufficient credit, and they can fall out of the academic career pathway at various stages, and they may fall into different parts of research infrastructure, but the career pathway for them is invisible and not as fruitful as the standard lone researcher career pathway. So how do these influences of research culture influence systematic reviews? Well, they're quite a good example and a way to illustrate the effect of research culture, because they are seen at the pinnacle of the evidence-based hierarchy. They are seen as the gold standard in evidence synthesis, able to give a comprehensive and unbiased view of the evidence base. But I've been working in the field of systematic reviews for almost 10 years when I had seen increasing examples of poorly conducted or flawed systematic reviews. They were often done by proponents of the intervention. For example, I would see whole teams of psychotherapists, physiotherapists, homeopathists reviewing their own interventions and declaring no conflicts. not pre-registering. So many journals will still accept systematic reviews for publications which have no protocol or were unregistered and didn't say what they were going to do in the first place. And we wouldn't really accept this for clinical trials. You do need to be registered in order to perform a trial. So why do we accept it for systematic reviews? Because these are highly cited, influential articles which often go on to influence clinical decision making for decades after they were published. Massaging data with meta-analyses. Because of the free and open availability of software, anyone can be a meta-analyst, and so it's quite easy for people to play around with different combinations of studies in order to see what would make an interesting overall pooled treatment effect. And reviews will often unduly highlight certain studies that may be favourable to the intervention, ignore negative ones, and spinning conclusions, especially because systematic reviews are a very dry read and often don't find anything particularly significant or novel. Spinning conclusions happens quite a bit. But even though we expect so much from systematic reviews, we're still not great at looking at systematic review teams to understand why are you doing this review and what's the motive behind it. And the reason why that's important is because reviews that claim to be systematic but aren't are much more harmful than just an editorial or a narrative review, because they claim to have this level of scientific integrity, which is often absent. So whilst I was preparing my fellowship application, I was seeing different papers highlighting different problems with systematic reviews. It wasn't just my own experience, but I noticed that they were often published in different journals, different medical specialities, often really good work, but it wasn't being built upon. They weren't aware of each other. They might be using different terminology to describe the same phenomena. At the same time, you have all these methodological bodies which are amazing in terms of providing open access, free guidance for people who want to do a systematic review, and they can help you in terms of the reporting and methodological conduct. But still, that wasn't really being reflected in the systematic reviews that were being submitted to me as a peer reviewer, as a journal editor, and as the lead of an evidence review group for NICE. So my fellowship research has been to create a living systematic review to be a one-stop dynamic resource to try to capture all those different conversations about the problems with systematic reviews and to collate them all into one place. So the project has a dedicated website, which is systematicrevolution.com or .org. It was registered on the Open Science Framework and Prospero before I started it. And there's also a published paper which describes the methods of it. But as it's a living review, the updates will be on the website. So I'm currently in the middle of the first update. It takes a lot longer to do an update than you would think. The general inclusion criteria for the review was that I wanted to include papers that were really talking about systematic reviews and with reference to published examples. So papers that would talk about potential problems in theory with systematic reviews but didn't actually point to published examples of reviews were excluded, as were meta-analyses that never claimed to be conducted in the context of a systematic review. So from the 485 included studies after about 10,000 citations, I managed to find 67 discrete problems with systematic review conduct, and you'll be glad to know we're not going through each of the problems today. I would guide you to look at the website. If you go to the framework of problems, each problem has its own web page and there's a description of it in my words at the top of the page, and references the guidelines that it refers to. But they all fall into these 4 domains that we expect from a systematic review. We expect it to be comprehensive, to be inclusive of every relevant study. We expect it to use the best practice methods and be rigorous. We expect it to be transparent and to be reported in a way that would allow an independent research team to conduct the same review and come to the same findings. And we expect it to be conducted by people who don't have a vested interest in the review, or at least if they do, that those interests are managed. At the same time as my research, there's others showing that systematic reviews as a publication type are really proliferating the evidence base. They really are a very popular choice, particularly in some countries, and outpacing primary clinical research. And you know, they are viewed in some ways as an easy publication because of their high quality reputation, but they're seen as desk-based research. They don't need ethical approval. You don't have the painstaking process of acquiring primary data. So they are kind of seen as a route to publication because of this label of systematic review being the gold standard in evidence synthesis. Additionally, I wouldn't have even included these meta-analyses which don't claim to be conducted in the context of a systematic review, but that as a publication type is exploding even more. I would just argue that I can't really think of a reason why we should want to pay much attention to a meta-analysis that has been done in the context of a systematic review. If they haven't been completely comprehensive and rigorous in their methods, then it's potentially a flawed and misleading meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a statistical technique, whereas a systematic review is a research project. It needs resources, funding, people, it takes time, and it takes good science to do a systematic review. But a meta-analysis could be done very quickly. So taken together, the fact that we're seeing so many problematic systematic reviews being conducted and published, and the fact that they do have this reputation for being at the top of the evidence hierarchy, they are contributing massively to research waste, and they will continue to whilst they're seen as an easy publication type for people to play this game that we do in research culture. The studies that are included in my review are meta studies, and again that is now becoming an even more prolific research study. It's very easy to take a sample of systematic reviews and see how well they adhere to the PRISMA guidelines. If I was to look at all the studies that I actually excluded from my review, we're probably talking about thousands of meta-research studies like that. Now, I extracted the first author country of the authors in the study, included studies in my review. And as you can see, we have an representation from certain parts of the world. And you can also, it's a double-edged sword, really, because it's obviously a good thing that we scrutinise systematic reviews and meta-research conduct. But also it shows that some countries have cottoned onto this fact and they're able to play this game, and these conversations are going on in some parts of the world and being furthered more and more and less so in other parts of the world. And this sort of trend is reflected in research generally, not just in systematic revolution. You see a lack of representation in terms of authorship practices in academic papers, and the lack of diversity in higher education and academia, and that you can be hypervisible and invisible as a BAME member of staff. Article processing charges is another barrier to research consumption and equity of research outputs in academia. And then there's increasing research which highlights that there is a lack of diversity in author teams, and that whilst the trend might be improving, it's still men that get cited more, and white men in particular. The COVID-19 pandemic was particularly divisive in terms of the public suddenly scrutinising who was doing science and what sort of science was informing decisions and who was making the decisions. And it really led to an era of misinformation and disinformation. And it's something that I'm aware of because my research aims to uphold systematic reviews, and I still maintain that they are the best way to do evidence synthesis when they're done well. The COVID-19 pandemic was not only divisive in terms of the general public, but also in academia. I mean, personally, I remember times in meetings with colleagues where people would say things like during lockdown, well, it's not bad working from home. I'm actually getting plenty done and being able to submit papers. And I remember thinking at the time, this is not fine. I'm not fine. I've become a dinner lady and a nursery nurse and a primary school teacher overnight, and a bad one at that. And I can't do my job. And there's evidence of that on my publication record. And so that time was incredibly damaging for the career of many, and I'm not sure how we will ever come to redress that gap where some people were able to get ahead during that time compared to baseline, and some people were actively hindered. The majority of us would want to consider ourselves as equitable people, and it's not that there are necessarily villains in science who are making things less diverse. We all want to make equitable decisions, but there are unconscious biases at play. So when researchers are given the CVs which are attributed to females, they are ranked lower, scored lower than the identical CV attributed to males, which shows that even, the most open-minded of us are susceptible to implicit biases. Nobody would choose to act this way, but we're dealing with biases that we're not consciously able to control. So, taken together, the influences of research culture impact research via a number of human influences. I would probably expand the Royal Society definition of research culture, because I think that research culture actually influences who does research and who they involve. I think it influences how research is conducted, how it's reported and disseminated, but then because of who is left in the game, it's also going to influence what research is proposed, prioritised and funded. So I'm aware that my research does always tend to focus on the problems, but the idea is that if we kind of let some daylight in on them, that we can all reflect on them. So I would apply the same 4 domains that I identified in systematic revolution and apply them to research generally. I think we should be looking to have diverse research teams. Homogeneous research teams can't produce research that reflects diverse populations. We need to consult representative stakeholders, make sure that we fund and involve people with the right expertise, adhere to best quality methods, say what we're going to do before we start to do it, have good data management plans, draw accurate inferences, share our data and create research legacies that enable other teams to reproduce our research, think about our potential conflicts and disclose them accurately, reward a range of career contributions, not just publications, but technicians and other support roles that go into producing research outputs, and to scope the research evidence base carefully before we propose a research question, so we're not doing duplicated or redundant research and we're answering questions that matter to people. So there are a number of research integrity initiatives. I've not really been able to list them all on one page, but they centre around how we share and upload data to enable people to reproduce it, how research is prioritised, how we can expand reward and assessment of researchers, and providing secure and varied career pathways for researchers. And I think, you know, just the fact that you're here today and willing to share a bit of time to think about research culture and research integrity is like the best start, really. Also, the ref return in the UK is going to incorporate research culture, which is hopefully an opportunity for more people to think about changes, small changes that they can make to address research culture. And there are conferences now specifically on research culture, like the one from the University of Warwick. I'll just do a quick plug for a funded PhD project that is closing on the 24th of January. So if you know any suitable candidates, but this is to look at the experiences of female ethnic minority staff in academia across disciplines. I'm a mixed race person from a working class background, and I don't see many people in leadership positions like me. And I'd like to use the privilege that I have to try to amplify that particular area and debate. So thank you for listening. Let me just have a little look at the comments and questions.